The small number of blacks who were free in colonial times were joined over the generations by increasing numbers of blacks who were either released from bondage or who escaped on their own.
This is talking about a small group of blacks who didn't spend much time in slavery because they were either set free by their owners or they eventually found some way to escape and find freedom on their own. And so many of these people, they would find themselves in the North where they would experience a completely different reality from the rest of the blacks who stayed in chains until the Emancipation Proclamation. But understand that this reality didn't last that long because those blacks from the South, they eventually followed suit. And when they did, they came to the North and took those communities by storm. And we'll see this as we continue reading in the book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell.
The growth of this largely unacculturated population, fugitives in the rough, in the words of Black historian Carter G. Woodson, in northern cities during the first half of the 19th century brought both social barriers and discriminatory laws barring Black children from schools and Black adults from equal access to public accommodations.
We're still talking about those who were freed early or escaped. And so they came to the North and they were unacculturated, or they had not taken on the culture of the dominant society. And so this presented a problem at this time to where the children and the adults didn't legally have access to certain things. So this is upon their early arrival to the North.
Yet, as these Black communities grew more acculturated over time and began to rise economically, these laws and practices began to be relaxed in many northern cities in the latter part of the 19th century.
So they started getting with the program and they changed up their culture. And as a result, they started being allowed to have access to certain things and to integrate into these people's neighborhoods.
Writing in 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois noted a growing liberal spirit toward the Negro in Philadelphia, in which the community was disposed to throw off the trammels, brush away petty hindrances, and to soften the harshness of race prejudice, leading, among other things, to blacks being able to live in white neighborhoods.
Which was probably some of those people's life goal, which is absolutely crazy, but we can see how this relationship was changing once they acculturated. So let's go ahead and see some more.
In Detroit, blacks who had been denied the vote in 1850 were voting in the 1880s, and in the 1890s, blacks were being elected to public office by a predominantly white electorate in Michigan.
And understand that this was happening way before the Civil Rights Act, and also that this was happening in a major city at this time.
The Black upper class in Detroit at that time had regular social interactions with whites, and their children attended high schools and colleges with whites. In Illinois during this same era, legal restrictions on access to public accommodations for blacks were removed from the law, even though there were not enough black voters at the time to influence public policy, so that this represented changes in white public opinion. By all indications, northern black urban communities were themselves becoming cleaner, safer, and more orderly during this era of improving race relations. So changes in white public opinion were not merely inexplicable mood swings.
Why were their neighborhoods becoming cleaner, safer, and more orderly? Because they dropped that slave culture and they picked up a different culture that was more appropriate for living in an urban area. And now what happened? They had more in common with those who identified as white. So it was expected that their relationship would improve, and it did. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying that this was not some type of random mood swing, right? It was actually a change in the character and the culture of the people that changed their relationship.
Neither were there later retrogressions in race relations in the North, which followed a massive influx of black migrants from the South, Black Rednecks, at the beginning of the 20th century.
It's about to get spicy because that relationship that they had developed was eventually destroyed when the great migration of black people from the South came into the North after being freed. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell calls them the Black Rednecks, but that's what I simply call just black people because they represent what the colonizers had in mind when they invented the Negro, right? And so black people who were newly released from the chains, they came up to the North and they brought that real black culture with them.
As late as 1890, 9/10 of all blacks in the United States still lived in the South, but those who lived in northern urban communities were largely from families long settled there.
90% of them lived in the South. And what this shows is the relatively small amount that lived in the North during this time. And it also helps understand why it was easier for those in the North to acculturate. And that's because they didn't have such a large group of countercultural black people influencing them and holding them back.
Most blacks living in New York State, for example, were born in New York State. In short, there were settled communities in both regions, and by all indications, the northern black communities at that time were acculturating to the norms of the northern white society around them. But all of that changed radically within a relatively few years, as massive migrations from the South not only enlarged northern black communities, but transformed them culturally.
Black people came from the South with that enticing slave black culture, and it took those acculturated blacks in the North by storm, and it was way too many of them, and their influence was just way too strong.
In 1900, for the first time, more than half of all blacks living in New York State had been born outside that state. Newcomers from the South became growing majorities in northern urban black communities in other states as well. The record-breaking migrations of blacks from the South to the North during the first decade of the 20th century was nearly tripled during the second decade, and that in turn was almost doubled again during the decade of the 1920s.
A whole bunch of black people coming to town.
Moreover, the proportion of these migrants coming from the Deep South, as distinguished from the Upper South, increased over time, which meant that the least educated and least acculturated became a growing proportion of the black migrant population moving into the northern cities. There were about 30,000 blacks living in Chicago in 1900, but this grew to well over 100,000 by 1920 and more than 277,000 by 1940.
And look at the black communities today in Chicago. Washington Park, Inglewood. These areas are steeped with violence, and the people there are primarily the descendants of these black people who came from the South with that slave black culture and that slave way of thinking.
We always in the trenches. Play at your own risk, baby. Everybody up there gone.
Look, on this traffic, folks. On all this traffic. No, stay right there. Stay on that, folks.
Interview Gen 5s on us spanking.
In Detroit, the black population grew from a little more than 4,000 in 1900 to more than 40,000 in 1920 and over 149,000 by 1940.
And eventually, what happened to Detroit? It reached its peak population in the 1950s with over 1.8 million people, and then eventually, after so many of those black people came in, most of the whites, they got up out of there. They started leaving the city. And so in 2024, it has just over 600,000 people left, right? And with just about 80% black people. And then on top of that, it's ranked for many years, at least in the top 5 most dangerous cities in America. And so these are the people who came over there and they settled in that land and they brought that culture with them and that mindset, and it evolved over time. And so you can go to Detroit in person, or you can look at Detroit online and you can see exactly what it has evolved into in today. And so we have to be honest with this full thing in order to get out of the pit. You have to be honest with it and deal with it.
But I got me a few.
New York City's black population was a little more than 60,000 in 1900, but grew to more than 150,000 by 1920 and more than 450,000 by 1940. Writing in the midst of these massive migrations, historian Carter G. Woodson predicted, "The maltreatment of the Negro will be nationalized by this exodus." This is what had happened 100 years earlier, and now it happened again. The sheer numbers of these new black migrants from the South not only overwhelmed the relatively small black populations in northern cities demographically in the early 20th century, their very different behavior patterns shocked both blacks and whites at the time, as witnessed by adverse comments from earlier black settlers and the black press, denouncing the new arrivals from the South as vulgar, rowdy, unwashed, and criminal.
You see that? They came with a very different behavior, and even the people in the North who still thought of themselves as black people, they even had to speak out against it, right? They thought those black people from the South were vulgar, rowdy, and criminal, right? And the biggest mistake that they made, the ones in the North, is that they continued identifying with those people, and they lumped themselves in there with that group.
Nor were these conclusions without foundation. For example, a study in early 20th century Pennsylvania found that the rate of violent crimes by blacks who had migrated there was nearly 5 times the rate of such crimes by blacks born in Pennsylvania.
Where did they learn the violence from? That slave setting in the South. Many of those slave masters were violent too, right? And the slave atmosphere is designed to make the most animal part of a person come out. And so I can imagine violence being a norm under those circumstances. But they brought that mentality with them to the normal society, and that's the big problem.
In Washington, the rate of births out of wedlock more than doubled with a large influx of Southern blacks during the late 19th century. One indication of the white reaction was that blacks no longer remained as free to live in white neighborhoods.
Access to the white community denied, and it eventually became hard to distinguish between who was who. All of them were calling themselves black people or Negroes, and most of them were acting abnormal in the eyes of the whites. And so they played it safe. And what did they do? They banned everyone who was classified as Negro from coming into those communities. And I don't blame them one bit when you look at it from their perspective.
This represented a major retrogression in race relations.
This is when things went downhill, and for the most part, it's still this way to this very day. And so the message is for people who are looking to finally grow completely away from the slave and colonizer identities. And one thing that I understand and that you have to understand as well is that most people are not anywhere near this phase of development, but some are, right? And that's who these videos are for, to help you climb rung by rung out of the pit to get into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so this is the end of part 9 commentary on the book here, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Dr. Thomas Sowell. And I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.